Dr. Sharon Estel Taylor, thank you for taking the time to talk with us. And you wrote your memoir, Phantom Father, A Daughter's Quest for Elegy, and it's about the recovery of the remains of your father shot down over Germany right near the end of the war in 1945. And we'll get into the substance of the memoir and your story. But I want to sort of start where we are now, looking back to going into the 1950s when you're a girl and you, as you recount in your memoir, you just sort of announced to people that your daddy was killed in the war. So going back to the 50s, from that time till now, how would you summarize this whole big, complicated, really lifelong story? If there is any way to summarize it, what are some of the words you would use to summarize it?
I think of it as a legacy. I think of it as something that was handed to me. I was born 3 weeks. My father was killed on April 13th. I was born March 20th. So we had 3 weeks on the planet without ever seeing each other. But when he was declared missing and then dead, it was this torch that was passed to me, or this light that was passed to me, that I carried, because it seemed to be my responsibility to never forget him. My mom wanted to not forget, but my mom had that pain that people have sometimes in grief, where they put it on a shelf. For me, it was a legacy. It became an obligation of sorts to keep it. And I didn't mind that, but it was heavy. It was heavy. And I was the representative of him to that whole side of the family. So I had this obligation to know. And the burning question for me was, what happened? So I carried it like a mystery, something I had to solve, a puzzle. People ask me about closure, but it isn't about closing anything. It was about learning something. And it never really fits as a closure. I do know a lot more than I knew when I started this, but it was truly a legacy and a gift.
Yeah.
That's how I look at it now.
Sure. You used the word obligation. And so when I think of an obligation, part of that is internally driven. I mean, something can't be an obligation if you don't accept it as an obligation. Other people can try to impose something on you, but you accept it.
Right.
But there does seem to be, I feel like I'm obliged to do something because there's something outside of me that I need to respond to. Does that make sense to you? I mean, to whom were you obliged? To what were you obliged to find out what happened to your dad?
It felt familial. His mother was the main driver of that. His siblings were of two different, he had a sister and a brother. They were of two different camps about the whole thing. They would just look at me like I was him. Like, oh, there she is. This only thing we have left. He was apparently drove much of the emotional stability in the family. He was really beloved. And so I inherited that. But I saw it as an obligation. I don't know. I don't think I had a choice. It was not, I'm not saying obligation in a bad way, but I'm saying it was an obligation, something that I was handed, that I had to do something with or completely ignore it. You could do one or two things. There was no in between. And so I waited, and really, truly, the world brought me that progress. They brought me that forward motion. And I have innate curiosity that never stops. So I'm still curious about more things,
Yeah.
and plus my imagination is huge.
Sure.
So that's how I coped as a child with my life, was by imagining. And he was always part of that imagining. I had a clear picture of my father because people told me, right? He's always with you. That's a nice Christian, Catholic, perhaps Jewish view too. I don't know, but I think it was like, that's where you get that he's watching. I remember the first time, not the first time I kissed a boy, but down the road a little bit when I was still young, I thought, oh my God, I can't do anything. He's right here. He sees me. You don't usually think of that about your parents, but I did. And
Well, yeah, I mean, there is a, you mentioned, sort of the Catholic idea of the cloud of witnesses who are still, we're basically,
Yes,
they're watching. And you do mention in your book a couple times, you mentioned in your memoir a couple times, the strong sense that your dad was present with
Mhm.
you. Um, So I actually would like to ask you about that, those moments. But do you feel like, you said this feeling of obligation is in your family, you sort of, took your father's place in a sense, you were sort of his representative.
Yes.
You kind of suggested that. Um, you had the good fortune of having a father who liked to write letters.
Mhm.
There are, and you have, I think you said something like 3,000 pages of letters. Is that
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So, and it probably won't come as news to you. There are a lot of men who aren't necessarily into writing letters, and so you're fortunate in that respect that you had all of those letters. Do you feel like this sense of obligation also, in some sense, came not just from living family members, but from your dad himself?
I'll tell you, it always, it's interesting because this entire story, once when I started searching for him, everything just flowed. And I don't know where that came from. I'm not positive, but I felt his presence. I have throughout my life, I felt his presence. Um, I've actually dreamed of him, of like what he would look like. He always sort of assumes the same sort of in my mind posture. But by the same token, then people would say, well, you're not letting him go. There's that.
Mm.
So I feel like he's been a guide for me. I mean, should one believe in angels or something, that's the kind of feeling it would be. Um, he, I've just always been really fortunate. The dad who raised me would say that I could fall into a pile of poop or shit, whichever you want
Yeah,
to say,
yeah.
and come out smelling like a rose. And that's truly been my life. I've really been like that. But I also know that I've felt the specialness because of him. I just know it's something I've inherited or my DNA works along those lines, but he's always been a present. Do I pray to him or any of that kind of thing? Not really, but I think of him. I know for sure when we were on the crash site excavating that he was 100% there because he had to be. That just felt, everybody was saying it. They salute him and say, good morning, Lieutenant Estel, here we are, that kind of thing. So he's a real presence. And I have a child who looks like him. So that helps. That's interesting. They resemble each other in many ways.
When you're at the crash site, your dad is there, and we can attach that to material physical things, and we'll get back to that, but it sounds like you're describing something that's more, for lack of a better phrase, spiritual or
Yeah.
psychological. um, you're saying that at the site in Germany, that the team that's there,
Mhm.
some are with the United States Defense Department agency responsible for that work. Others
Right.
are German civilians. You've also got journalists around, et cetera. But you're saying that folks within that group who are excavating the crash site, they are sort of talking to your dad and saying, "Here we are," and
Every time I've allowed someone before I wrote the book to read the letters or be involved in something to do with him, or see his picture, if I sent his photograph for some reason to someone,
yeah.
I would always think, I said, be careful, you're going to fall in love with him. You're going to love this guy. And this is what happens. Everyone at the crash site um, became attached to his memory or to him. I mean, it was a holy place in that sense that everyone really, and I was so impressed because there wasn't a single person on the team who didn't feel it in their heart and take really good care of me around that. But they also treated me as an equal. So when it came time for me, with the only other woman on the team, to dig the latrine hole,
Mm,
that was my job, because I said, I'm here, I'll do whatever. And,
sure.
they tried to make us all equal, but we were in awe of each other because he was present. And I don't think for one instant I would have found him without his assistance in finding Hans Günther Plus, the guy who ultimately directed the whole thing.
Yeah, he's a German researcher whom you mentioned continuously through the book and who plays probably the key role, right? In
Yes.
helping to find your dad's remains, and we'll talk about him. Now, I know as I ask this question, it's not really answerable because we're talking about something I think that's beyond language, really. But it sounds like you're describing there's the feeling that, in one way or another, dad's always there, sort of a guiding light, sort of a continuous presence, certainly a presence in my mind, a presence in my soul. But it sounds like there are certain moments, maybe especially at the recovery site, where that sense is much more powerful than usual. And if that's the case, what sorts of words would you use to describe that?
I know when I first really felt it strongly was the very first time tracked down all of his remaining squadron members. And that was a very long time ago, 20 years or more, but they were all the people who knew him in that setting, in the war setting, in flying setting. And the first time I was gathered with them, I just felt like this is where I belonged. This is what it is. I stepped into the role as my father's daughter, which I'd never done before. I was introduced as, who this is? This is Shannon's daughter. And it was like, wow, I had a dad who raised me, so I'd acclimated to that. So, wow, to be allowed to be his daughter, that's huge. And there have been times when I've done public speaking, especially at the World War II Museum, when we premiered the film with Spiegel TV, where I just, something happens when I'm speaking in front of a group about him that feels like it's comforting. It's a comforting thing to do, and he approves. Before I ever started the search, I wanted to transcribe all those letters, those 3,000 pages, and I think I wrote about it. But the truth is, I said to my parents, if you don't want me to do this, Catholic me, if you don't want me to do this, let me know, make it boring. Because I was just about to enter a master's program, and I knew I was going to be busy. And I said, make it boring. I know how I can be. And it flew. The words flew off of that page onto my transcription, took it to Xerox to have a copy. They didn't charge me because they were so involved in reading the letters. So the whole thing just happened. So it's almost like I look to them for guidance. Many, many years, I've written to him in my journal for advice, parenting advice, or keep him once a year on the day he died. I tell him what's happened over the last year, just a couple pages, but they're interesting letters. One year I wrote and said, the kid who looks like him was in high school. And I said, please make this safe transit. I would do that kind of thing. So why not?
Sure.
Why not?
Your dad's loss, and that's another thing that we need to talk about, just sort of, what are the basics of the story. Your dad's loss strikes me as particularly tragic because it comes so close to the end of the war. I was just of the war in Europe. I was just talking with a history class and talking about how, and we were talking about the Civil War, and you read the diaries and the letters from the Civil War, and of course you read about the battle casualties, but there's something particularly pathetic in that deepest sort of Greek sense of pathos of reading about soldiers killed in battle just 2 or 3 days before the end of the war. It's very close to the end of the war when your dad is killed. That's tragic. It's part of this colossal tragedy that is the Second World War. And then there's the tragedy for you, growing up and telling people my daddy was killed in the war.
Yeah.
Now you have, referred to your Catholic upbringing, and there is an idea though in Christian writings that all things, although horrible in themselves, can nevertheless work out for good. And do you feel that for all of the tragedy in some way though, you've also and I don't know how this is going to sound, so please take it in the spirit in which it's offered, but do you feel that for all of the tragedy, in some way, you were kind of given a gift at the same time of a kind of life mission that not only gave you a sense
Yeah,
of purpose, but has helped other people? Do you feel that that's the case?
absolutely. Thank you. That's a great question. So much better than have you found closure? That makes perfect sense. That's exactly because I can reframe it any way I want. And I do associate with an awful lot of, there's a group of people, the American War Orphans Network, and they're still, I don't want to say actively grieving, but that's what it looks like. There's an awful lot of never, unable to reframe it in any way. And I threatened them in some way in the very beginning because I was willing to go there and say, there is another way to look at this. That your father I mean, I almost feel like my father went out as I came in. He did. They had the chairs for the signing of all of the stuff that was going to end the war in Europe in Torgau set up. He was 15 kilometers from that. It was ready to roll. They were going to close that war down. Now, unfortunately, the part where he crashed went to the Russians, which made it difficult for me to ever get in there until the wall came down. But you're so right. It's absolutely my quest, my father quest. And it's led me to do a lot of things. Look, I got a PhD by using this topic. And it was difficult. It's a hard one to sell because you really got to make poignant sense. So what did I do? I became a specialist in grief and loss. Oh yeah, it was a gift. It was absolutely a gift.
Yeah,
It's
I think there's something profound in there that, just sort of conceptually, a person hands you a box and the box is sort of the wrapping of the box is this tragedy, but you unwrap it and not despite all of that remains, but yet nevertheless somehow it becomes a gift at the same.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and look at my association with the World War II Museum from meeting the now CEO who wasn't. It was another CEO before that, Stephen Ambrose, started the museum, and Nick Mueller. Those two guys were friends, and they had to get rid of all the stuff, all the antiquities they'd collected from World War II. The story was their wives said, "Get this stuff out of here." So they built a museum and they started it. But I met that CEO many years ago when I was just coming back from the excavation, and now I'm on the board of trustees. And now the World War II Museum is another present inside that present. I mean, I have credibility because I did this quest. My father has given me, his story has given me many, many things. And my mission was to just never let him be forgotten.
Wow.
And it's far reaching, you know?
Sure.
Yeah.
Tell us the story. What do you know about? We've been using the word crash. What do we know about that? Was the plane shot down? Was it an accident? What do we know about what happened in April 1945?
Friday, April 13, right?
Oh,
I think I know everything because it's been pieced together. It's like what I used to say was I was given a box with puzzle pieces in it, and I just didn't have any clue what there were no pictures on the puzzle. So we had to go from scratch. And what we found out was, yes, that he and his the pilots who were flying with him saw it happen, and then they hightail it out of there. That's their procedure. That's what they do. But they wrote down on the pads that they had on their legs, they had paper and pen, and they wrote it down as best they could, the coordinates and that type of thing. But apparently they had gone on a mission. They were coming back to where they were staying in the tents in the mud. And there was a train with a anti-aircraft gun sitting on one of the flat cars. And he just pointed it in the sky. And my father was the one who was chosen out of all those people flying. He was, nothing unusual about it. He just was. And the way he was hit, nobody could see him bail out, right? So basically the plane, blew up in the air and then landed and crashed. Then no one could get back in there. It was still wartime. And when they tried to go back later, the Russians wouldn't let them in.
Right.
So it was fascinating. Basically, we know exactly what happened based on what they found when they did the excavation, because we got on a tall ladder and we could see how it landed. It was a beautiful picture. I love that because you could see that one wing was missing. You know, the things that we found showed that he, plowed right into the dirt and then burned. So
Wow.
it was pretty clear. But until you see that, there's always a possibility that he's out there. That's what an awful lot of us carry. It's that fantasy that he really didn't crash, really didn't die.
Did you experience that? I've heard that from other family members who
Yes.
speak of being children and just sort of anticipating that one day the knock would come at the door and there he would be.
Oh yeah, sure. Well, his family created some of that myth for me. His brother in particular, they would say things like, he's a spy, and all that kind of thing. And I'd tell my mom when I'd hear it, she'd say, honey, I will guarantee you, if he's around, he will find us, he will be back. So he's probably not, it's been how many years, but she'd say, he's never gonna. And I would say to her, being the child that I was, I'd say, so if he comes back, do we stay married to this dad or do we go? And it was a terrible thing to ask, but I really wanted to know how it was going to work.
What did she say?
She wouldn't cop to that. She would be like, that's a tough question, that kind of thing. But I wanted her to say, of course.
Sure.
Yeah.
Wow.
But there was no way. There was no human way that man could have survived anything. He was dead before. Well, actually, the question I asked the archaeologist was the very end of the site. I said, so did he die up there or down here? And he said, well, Doc, what do you prefer? We don't know.
Yeah.
We don't know. Yeah. Probably up there.
Walk us through when did it become apparent or possible in your mind, when did you realize that recovery might actually be possible? What was the first thing that happened that indicated to you, we might actually be able to go to Germany and go to the site? So how did this whole recovery process begin? The recovery of the remains, recovery of parts of the plane.
I arranged to meet Hans Günther Plus through a circuitous route that started with my father's squadron mates. Everybody knew somebody who knew somebody. I was sent to a guy who looks for aircraft in Belgium. He sent me to somebody else, and eventually I ended up corresponding with Hans Günther. And that was, I have this date on here, but that was like close to 2000-ish, I guess. And he and I met, and he said, we had no clue where the crash site was, but if anyone were to find out what happened, it was him. And because he knew where most all the crash sites were in all of Germany. Wow. Who crashed where? He has a museum of an apartment. I mean, it's not anything like you can imagine. We talk a lot about what are we going to do with our stuff, because we have all this stuff now, archival stuff, right? Sure. So he said, if we find it, he said, you have to be very patient. And that is not my long suit, is patience. He said, you have to be very patient. If we find it, then we'll talk about how we get it excavated. But with luck being as it was, when they finally, several years later, found what they thought was the crash site, they found that telling bone on the top of the dirt 60 years later, which turned out to be part of my father's body. It was a femur, piece of a femur on top of the dirt. Imagine.
Wow.
Well, how did that happen? That's that magic stuff. So we had that sent over to Longstuhl to the lab there. Then they knew there were human remains in this place. So from that point forward, I spoke to JPAC, which is now DPAA, Joint POW MIA Command, now DPAA, and I called them maybe every day for a year, every day. I spoke to people, I emailed them, I texted them, I drove them insane. And I said, if you're going to do an excavation, please do an excavation. And if you do it, I want to be there. So it basically, after we found it, I didn't want to pay for that. I would have had to pay for it. I turned it over to the government and hoped, and it worked.
Oh. Now, Hans Gunter Plus, you mentioned him a lot. He's a
Oh, yeah.
real presence in your memoir. Is this something, I mean, is this his work? Is this volunteer work? What,
For
what is
him,
this? Yeah.
it's his life's mission. It's what he does. He's the premier aircraft historian, World War II and now World War I as well. Aircraft historian in the world, I think. No one had ever asked him before to help them do anything like this. And when he was interviewed later, they said, "Well, why did you help her?" And he said, "Well, she asked me." And it was fun for us. I mean, it shouldn't be, but we had a really good time and a really good friendship. And he was brilliant. I mean, you talk about living history. You, as a historian, would spend an hour with this guy and you just can't get enough.
Mhm.
He insisted that as we were driving around Germany together, time and time and time again, that I saw that he showed me what we did to Germany. So the same token, like this is the town that the US bombed into oblivion. This is the town that, I mean, look at Dresden. Look what the Brits did in Dresden and how that is. I mean, these are sober visits, but so essential. And I learned so much, more than I needed to learn, really. I
Sure.
know how the clock is
Yeah.
built. I don't just know what time it is.
Yeah. One of the
So,
things I'm hearing you say, or that one of my interpretations of what you're saying is you describe Hans Gunter Plus as how the world benefits when people acquire a life mission and pursue it with excellence. Not only do
yes,
they benefit themselves by having a sense of purpose and mission, but others benefit from that as well.
yeah,
And
I
that I
agree
think
with
that's
that.
been apparent both in his work and in yours.
Well,
How much work was accomplished before the responsible US government agency got involved? How far down the road did Hans Gunter Plus and others who may have been involved get things down the road before the US government agency got involved?
everything. We did it. I mean, they did not find the crash site. They did not. Well, the best story I have about that, I would say 90%. That would maybe make our government a little bit argue with me, but probably not, because they stood in awe of what we had accomplished before they ever got there. The very first day they were there, they were setting up a bunch of little red and orange and yellow flags because they had a way of figuring out what they thought was under the ground. And Hans Gunter showed up that morning and he said, "No, no, 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 this is wrong. Move it over here. Like, this is where you're going to find the cockpit." And they were like, "Who is this guy? Some German, relic hunter." And
Yeah,
I said, "You better pay attention because he knows." It was almost like he has the most amazing intuition about what's there and what lies beneath. And you know what? He was 1,000% right. If there is 1,000%, he was so right. They moved it. They complained, but they moved all their stuff over. He just said, "That's all you have to do." And sure enough, we found exactly. We could have been off by a good half a block in that field. So I would say Hans Günther and his team in Germany, Spiegel TV following us around, gave us a lot of interesting moments. And I think we did it all. We got them in at the last minute to do the heavy lifting.
right. And then finally, the actual DNA work involved in the
Yeah.
identification of the remains as well. Yeah.
Yes.
How was, you've kind of touched on this already, but how was the relationship, once the personnel with the Defense Department agency responsible for recoveries, once they come on the scene, and as you describe it, they come into the story pretty late. How did that relationship work out? You've kind of touched on that a bit, but how did the relationship work out the time the US government agency is on the scene and Hans Gunter plus yourself and the others, the German civilians are there? How did it go?
It was magnificent. There wasn't an issue. I told them the first day, I know it's unusual to have a family member here. Mostly they were working in Vietnam. They stopped that work and came to Germany. They had a couple things they wanted to do. And I said, "But I'm here and I want to work. I'm a worker." And I said, and if you want help from the Germans, and this, we're talking like heavy, dirty work, basically. I said, Hans Günther Pliss and the people he knows would love to help, that kind of thing. We became a team, and they accepted me, and we became very close. I mean, you spend 24/7 in the dirt, and then at night you go have pizza and drink beer. That's a thing. And it was the military. You can never get away from that. And I love that. I love the way our military operates in those settings and others. And I had just come off of working on a army base in Gießen right after 9/11. And so I was pretty comfortable with that whole, I knew my way around the military ranking and setting in my little place. We actually loved each other. I think that's how it ended up. We were crazy about each other by the time it ended.
Wow.
And we just were. We laughed together. We cried together. We fought battles together, didn't we? With, people not wanting us to do that.
Yeah.
And throughout it all, they carried my father's memory with them, and they did it for him. They did it for him because their mission is, they say no man left behind, but I think now they say no one left behind.
Right.
And they mean it.
How long did the whole excavation process go on at the site?
About 3 weeks.
About 3 weeks.
Yeah.
And I imagine this is a gradual thing where, parts of the plane are being recovered, human remains are being recovered. Was there a particular moment? I mean, and I imagine you know that you're in the right place. Was there a particular moment where something was found and the team realizes, okay, yeah, this is it. This is absolute confirmation that we're in the right place?
The only time that happened really was the time you can't forget if you were there. And it was a Sunday morning. Everyone was there, and I mean everyone. Hans Günther, the Spiegel TV team, we were all like, we were just there. And they were digging in the cockpit area. And what the main mission to find was the data plate, one of the data plates, which were on the engines. And that would, without doubt, identify this was the right plane, right? So we're messing around, and Dr. Fox, who's the anthropologist, archaeologist guy, was in the dirt, way down in the dirt, and he found something, and he poured a water bottle over it and kind of started to rub it, and he was yelling for Hans Günther to come over right away. See, that's how close, that's how it all got, was they depended on him. And he came over, he looked at it, he pulled out a book with stuff in it that told about what all the markings for the plane were. And he said, absolutely, this is Lieutenant Estel's plane, just like that. And we were all, I can't even, and that was that moment where the world just became surreal for all of us. We just looked at each other like, oh my God. Which also, though, marked the end of the need for the excavation, because they didn't do much more. We already had almost 3 weeks of stuff, plus remains, enough to fill both my hands. That was it. But we already had that. So that was the most defining moment of the whole thing. So it was bittersweet.
Wow.
Bittersweet. But we knew.
Now those remains are buried at Arlington, is that right? At the Arlington National Cemetery?
We took them, the same guy, the archaeologist, Dr. Fox, took them back to Hawaii, to the JPAC headquarters, into the lab. At that point, they then prepared them for the repatriation ceremony, which made it look like that we flew him in from Germany, but we didn't. It was already there. And they put him in a regular, a thing that fit into the plane, like you see when you see the people being returned. And they did a beautiful job of that. We had a real ceremony, and then they identified the DNA, and it was easily defined that he was, by the way, through his sister's matrilineal DNA, not through mine, but through hers. It had to be someone. If my aunt Margie, if she hadn't been living, that would have been a difficult thing to get, because it had to come from a woman in the family, but not me.
You're talking about, you said remains that can fit in both hands. So, something, but not a lot. And here, this again is a psychological or spiritual question maybe. When those remains were buried at Arlington, was there, and I'm not getting at the question of closure, but was there that feeling that, okay, not just these remains are back in the States, but the language that's used is he's home,
Yeah,
he's come home. Is that not just, is that the phrase we use, but is that how it really felt?
yes, did. It also felt like part of him was still in Germany. And that was also based on a conversation I had with Dr. Fox. And I said, do you think we have everything? And he said, no, probably not. So he said, think about the fact that he's, he has a presence in both places. And I like that. I do.
Mm,
I'm not much for visiting cemeteries and all that kind of thing. I mean, I have, but not with any great enthusiasm. But I love that he's in Arlington. I love that. Now my mission is, if you want to know, and I need to speak to Senator Kelly about this, I want to be buried there too. And that's never done. They don't take kids and bury them with their dads, but I'm working on it.
wow, wow,
I do. I want to be with them. I want them to put me right in the same place.
yeah.
It's just a beautiful box. I have another one here. Just a beautiful box. They put it in the dirt. That's how it goes. It's very organic. It's
Sure.
not John Kennedy,
Right, right. I just have
Yeah, I love it.
yeah. I just have a couple more questions. You share a story in the memoir that reminds me very much of another story I heard, and that is that the permissions are acquired to excavate in, I guess this is farmland, is that right? But apparently one farmer was overlooked. There was one farmer whose permission was not gotten before the excavation began. Can you just recount that story, and that story, sort of from the possibility that this one farmer might just derail everything to your reading of is it your reading of a letter, or I think is it the interpreter, you read the letter and then the interpreter translates it into German, something like that. Could you just recount that story for us?
I love that story. That's my favorite thing. So we were happily doing our thing, not too far into the excavation, not far at all, maybe the first week. And as I tell in the book, this guy drove up very fast along Butcherstrasse Road, which is the road where it all was, right happening. And he, the guy who is my translator and my friend, a German guy, went out there to speak to him. And the military translator came rushing up to help, and the German guy stopped him, like, no, I'm going to deal with this in German, and you just stay there and let me see what's happening. They spoke for a long time. He came back and he said, basically, no one asked his permission. He objects, and we can't go forward. So I think it was like 3:00 in the afternoon, maybe something like that. So we stopped. We went back to the hotel. We were all staying in the same place. And we decided we'd meet at our favorite pizza place, go to Germany and have pizza, right? Meet at our favorite pizza place and figure out what the heck we were going to do. And I'm just going, this is not going to happen. I don't know what I'm going to have to do, but it's not going to happen. That's what I'm thinking in my head. And that's what I'm telling the Germans. So the Americans have a ton of ideas, like tough guy ideas, like the American military is going to go in there and blah, blah, blah. And I said, no, we're not going to do any of that. Everybody was all fired up, is what I'm saying. And there were some young ones who really wanted to get justice. So basically, I went back to the hotel and I wrote that letter. And it was middle of the night by the time I finished it. So I called Ernst Eberle, who was the guy who was the translator and my friend. And I said, can I get this to you first thing in the morning early? And can you translate it all into German? And then I want you to print it and put it in your pocket. So I had, at some point in time that next day, we were supposed to meet with that farmer, his brother, and the guy who was the mayor of the little Elsnick, the little town, and the burgermeister. So I said, I told the team, I said, I wrote a letter, and whoever was in charge of saying things at that day said, no, we're not going down that road. We're not going to do that. We're going to handle this. Government's going to handle this. So I said, oh, okay. But I knew Hans Günther had the letter in his pocket. I mean, that Ernst Everly had the letter. So we get to this roundtable meeting. Ernst puts himself at the end of the table. The brothers are to his right. I am right across from them, and they don't look at me at all. They will not look up. So the meeting begins, and it feels a little choppy. And Ernst takes the letter out of his pocket and begins to read to these guys in German. And the people, the American team is just like in silence watching this whole thing. They get up, brothers get up, they take the letter with them. They get up and go outside of the room. And we wait. They come back in and they sit at the table and they look me in the eye and they say, you should teach the American government about diplomacy. And they said it in German, and then someone told me. They said, this is what we hear you. And, you know, I wrote it in a relational way because I come from farming people in Oklahoma. So, you know, not that I get that, but I figured this is a good connection. And I left it up to, you know, the universe, what's going to happen. And they not only granted us full permission, but from that point forward, they came to the crash site and brought beer and took our guys hunting, boar hunting.
Really?
It was amazing, yeah. And there are pictures of me standing with my arms around these two guys. I mean, that would not have happened. So
Wow.
I think we did a good job. I really do. And we proceeded then and finished the excavation.
Well, I encourage people to get your memoir and to read that letter. I think that's really the part of the memoir that most sticks out in my mind as well. It just shows, you know, I can't think of a sophisticated way of putting it. It just shows how the human touch can get things done. You know,
Yes.
you've got people who are pulling power moves, you know, in different ways.
Yeah.
And then you just, you know, parachute in a little bit of humanity, and it's not always going to work. I mean, the world's a rough place, but in this case, it did. Do you have any sense of were these farmers, were they so upset and adamant that this would not go on just because their permission had not been asked and they felt affronted? Or do you feel it was partly maybe lingering resentments from the war? Or what do you think motivated that?
It was historic, definitely, because there's still a lot of resentment for what we did, and then what the Russians subsequently did, how they took over. And they, you know, you go there and you're still in the 50s in that part of Germany.
Really?
You really are. I mean, you go out to dinner and the lights are bright and you're sitting in like a, you know, a diner kind of thing. Very few things have progressed, which I also served us well, because that field was as it was the day he crashed into it.
Yeah.
Nothing had changed. But they had continued throughout the years and during the time of the war to clean it up, including his body parts that were found and the roads and every place else. I mean, this is not a pretty thing. This is not like you see in the movies.
Sure.
You know, it's bad. So it was a gravesite, among other things.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, yeah, I think it's a great story because, you know, you recount in the memoir that you're told, you know, hold on to this letter, you know, only in case of fire, I think is the phrase, or something like that, should you pull this letter out. And you know, as I was reading that, I thought, oh, you know, is this going to get derailed? But it was, you know, it's a great moment in the story. The last question, you mentioned early in the discussion, you mentioned the American War Orphans Network, and there are other organizations out there, family members of those who are still missing, Second World War, Korea, Vietnam. What word do you have for those? When you just mentioned the American War Orphans Network, you said that there are people who are still sort of grieving, you know, that's the word that you used. And what word do you have for those family members who still just, you know, just live with question marks? That's all they have. Some of them don't even know what happened. They don't know how their loved one disappeared.
There's a name for it. It's called disenfranchised grief. And it's the unknown. You know, you're grieving something you can't even, you know, finish with. And you don't know much about, but you know you're sad about it. There's also a big difference between grief and loss and how you express that. I mean, this is all those, but you said it well when you said having a quest is really important in life. Many quests, many missions, many things you do. I signed the last group of books that were now used at the museum for some events they were doing with "Find Your Quest." That's how I inscribed it. Find your quest. That's really important. If you don't have one, find one. I would say it falls into a couple of categories in terms of leaving that. You either accept it, right? It's like the serenity prayer. You accept what you can't change what you can, know the difference. If there's a way you feel like you as a person who has a parent or someone who was lost in say World War II, there are ways to do this. There are organizations that would help you start that search, but it takes a lot, and you have to be tough, and you have to be resilient. And in some cases, you have to have money. It's like searching for a child you put up for adoption. Same thing, feels the same. You're going up the down staircase in a million cases. But if someone you love has been lost at sea, the chances of you finding them are zero. You just won't.
Mm.
When that was very typical. Some of the women I interviewed for my dissertation had Navy dads, and there's no way they're ever going to hold their remains in their hands. I think it comes from your heart. You know, I can put this in real simple terms. If you have someone in your life who's missing, like say your high school girlfriend or something, and you want to know whatever happened to her, it's pretty simple now to look her up and find out what happened. This is in that same realm, but in a deeper way.
Mm-hmm.
But, sometimes the truth isn't what you want. I mean, many people found the stories and their fathers were killed by friendly fire.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's interesting. I always say go for it because I love that. Everyone who's ever asked me about it, and I get many requests for how'd you do that. It's like, go do it. You'll find your path.
Sure.
And it's good to know. It's good to know. For sure.
Well, Dr. Sharon Estel Taylor, I appreciate you taking the time to share these memories. I hope others will be encouraged to share their memories. I think there are a lot of folks who just sort of live with all of this quietly.
Yes.
But I hope that they'll be encouraged to share their stories. Thank you for sharing yours in memoir form, and then you mentioned a few times the documentary that Der Spiegel in Germany put on, and that's in German and English, and perhaps in other languages too. I don't know, but
yes.
German and English. Sounds good.
They show it all over. Whenever I used to go to Europe, I haven't been there in a minute.
Yeah.
I could any late night TV, I would be likely to see it. It's really interesting in whatever language. So
thank you again for the memoir and for taking this time. I hope others are encouraged by what you've said. I hope folks will read the memoir, read not just what you write, your own story, but you also excerpt a lot of your dad's letters. You include the letter that you read there in Germany that helped to get past that difficult situation with the farmer. So it's certainly worth the time, and I appreciate you taking the time. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your interest.